Reading on Reconstruction. After the Civil War, much of the South lay in ruins. It passes my comprehension to tell what became of our railroads, one South Carolinian told a Northern reporter. We had passably good roads on which we could reach almost any part of the state, and the next week they were all gone. Not simply broken up, but gone. Some of the material was burned, I know, but miles and miles of iron have actually disappeared, gone out of existence. He might as well have been talking about the entire antebellum way of life. The future of the South was uncertain. How would these states be brought back into the Union? Would they be conquered territories or equal states? How would they rebuild their governments, economies, and social systems? What rights did freedom confer on formerly enslaved people? The answers to many of Reconstruction's questions hinged on the concepts of citizenship and equality. The era witnessed perhaps the most open and widespread discussions of citizenship since the nation's founding. It was a moment of revolutionary possibility and violent backlash. African Americans and radical Republicans pushed the nation to finally realize the Declaration of Independence promise that all men are created equal and have certain unalienable rights. White Democrats granted African Americans legal freedom, but little more. When Black Americans and their radical allies succeeded in securing citizenship for freed people, a new fight commenced to determine the legal, political, and social implications of American citizenship. Resistance continued, and Reconstruction eventually collapsed. In the South, limits on human freedom endured and would stand for nearly a century more. Reconstruction brought the first moment of mass democratic participation for African Americans. In 1860, only 5 states in the North allowed African Americans to vote on equal terms with whites. Yet, after 1867, when Congress ordered Southern states to eliminate racial discrimination in voting, African Americans began to win elections across the South. In a short time, the South was transformed from an all white, pro slavery Democratic stronghold to a collection of Republican led states with African Americans in positions of power for the first time in American history. Through the provisions of the Congressional Reconstruction Acts, black men voted in large numbers and also served as delegates to the state constitutional conventions in 1868. Black delegates actively participated in revising state constitutions. One of the most significant accomplishments of these conventions was the establishment of a public school system. While public schools were virtually non existent in the antebellum period, by the end of Reconstruction, every Southern state had established a public school system. Republican officials opened state institutions like mental asylums, hospitals, orphanages, and prisons to white and black residents, though often on a segregated basis. They actively sought industrial development, northern investment, and internal improvements. African Americans served at every level of government during Reconstruction. At the federal level, Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce were chosen as U.S. Senators from Mississippi. 14 men served in the House of Representatives. At least 270 other African American men served in patronage positions as postmasters, custom officials, assessors, and ambassadors. At the state level, more than 1,000 African American men held offices in the South. PBS Pinchback served as Louisiana's governor for 34 days after the previous governor was suspended during the impeachment proceedings and was the only African American state governor until Virginia elected L. Douglas Wilder in 1989. Almost 800 African American men served as state legislators around the South, with African Americans at one time making up a majority of the South Carolina House of Representatives. African American office holders came from diverse backgrounds. Many had been born free or had gained their freedom before the Civil War. Many free African Americans, particularly those in South Carolina, Virginia, and Louisiana, were wealthy and well educated. two facts that distinguish them from much of the white population, both before and after the Civil War. Some, like Antoine Dubois of Louisiana and William Breedlove from Virginia, owned enslaved laborers before the Civil War. Others had helped enslaved people escape or taught them to read, like Georgia's James D. Porter. Most African American office holders, however, gained their freedom during the war. Among them were skilled craftsmen like Emmanuel Fortune, a shoemaker from Florida, ministers such as James D. Lynch from Mississippi, and teachers like William B. Turner from Alabama. Moving into political life was a natural continuation of the leadership roles they had held for their former communities. By the end of Reconstruction in 1877, more than 2,000 African American men had served in offices ranging from local levy commissioner to U.S. Senator. When the end of Reconstruction returned white Democrats to power in the South, all but a few African American office holders lost their positions. After Reconstruction, African Americans did not enter the political arena again in large numbers until well into the 20th century. The meaning of Black freedom. Land was one of the major desires of the freed people. Frustrated by responsibility for the growing numbers of freed people following his troops, General William T. Sherman issued Special Field Order Number 15, in which land in Georgia and South Carolina was to be set aside as a homestead for the freed people. Sherman lacked the authority to confiscate and distribute land, so this plan never fully took effect. One of the main purposes of the Freedmen's Bureau, however, was to redistribute lands to formerly enslaved people that had been abandoned and confiscated by the federal government. Even these land grants were short lived. In 1866, land that ex Confederates had left behind was reinstated to them. Freed people's hopes of land reform were unceremoniously dashed as Freedmen's Bureau agents held meetings with the freedmen throughout the South, telling them the promise of land was not going to be honored and that instead they should plan to go back to work for their former enslaver as wage laborers. The policy reversal came as quite a shock. In one instant, Freedmen's Bureau Commissioner General Oliver O. Howard went to Edisto Island to inform the black population there of the policy change. The Black Commission's response was that we were promised homesteads by the government. You ask us to forgive the landowners of our island? The man who tied me to a tree and gave me 39 lashes, and who stripped and flogged my mother and my sister, that man I cannot well forgive. Does it look as if he has forgiven me, seeing how he tries to keep me in a condition of helplessness? In working to ensure the crops would be harvested, agents sometimes coerced formerly enslaved people into signing contracts with their former enslavers. However, the Bureau also instituted courts where African Americans could seek redress if their employers were abusing them or not paying them. The last ember of hope for land redistribution was extinguished when Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner's proposed land reform bills were tabled in Congress. Radicalism had its limits, and the Republican Party, their commitment to economic stability, eclipsed their interest in racial justice. Another aspect of the pursuit of freedom was the reconstitution of families. Many freed people immediately left plantations in search of family members who had been sold away. Newspaper ads sought information about long lost relatives. People placed these ads until the turn of the 20th century, demonstrating the enduring pursuit of family reunification. Freed people sought to gain control over their own children or other children who had been apprenticed to white masters either during the war or as a result of the Black Codes. Above all, freed people wanted freedom to control their families. Many freed people rushed to solemnize unions with formal wedding ceremonies. Black people's desires to marry fit the government's goal to make free black men responsible for their own households and to prevent black women and children from becoming dependent on the government. Freed people placed a great emphasis on education for their children and themselves. For many, the ability to finally read the Bible for themselves induced work weary men and women to spend all evenings or Sunday attending night school or Sunday school classes. It was not uncommon to find a one room school with more than 50 students ranging in age from 3 to 80. As Booker T. Washington famously described the situation, it was a whole race trying to go to school. Few were too young and none too old to make the attempt to learn. Many churches served as schoolhouses and as a result became central to the freedom struggle. Free and freed black Southerners carried well formed political and organizational skills into freedom. They developed anti racist policies and organized skills through anti slavery organization turned church associations. Liberated from white controlled churches, black Americans remade their religious world according to their own social and spiritual desires. One of the more marked transformations that took place after emancipation was the proliferation of independent black churches and church associations. In the 1930s, nearly 40% of 663 black churches surveyed had their organizational roots in the post emancipation era. Many independent black churches emerged in the rural areas, and most of them had never been affiliated with white churches. Many of these independent churches were quickly organized into regional, state, and even national associations, often by brigades of free black Northerners and Midwesterners who went to the South to help the freedmen. Through associations like the Virginia Baptist State Convention and the Consolidated American Baptist Missionary Convention, Baptists became the fastest growing post emancipation denomination, building on their anti slavery associational roots and carrying on the struggle for black political participation. Tensions between Northerners and Southerners over styles of worship and educational requirements strained these associations. Southern rural black churches preferred worship services with more emphasis on inspired preaching, while black urban Northerners favored more orderly worship and an educated ministry. Perhaps the most significant internal transformation in church had to do with the role of women, a situation that eventually would lead to the development of independent women's conventions in Baptist, Methodist, and Pentecostal churches. Women like Nanny Helen Burroughs and Virginia Broughton, leaders of the Baptist Women's Convention, worked to protect black women from sexual violence from white men. Black representatives repeatedly articulated this concern in state constitutional conventions early in the Reconstruction era. In churches, women continued to fight for equal treatment and access to the pulpit as preachers, even though they were able to vote in church meetings. Black churches provided centralized leadership and organization in post emancipation communities. Many political leaders and office holders were ministers. Churches were often the largest building in town and served as community centers. Access to pulpits and growing congregations provided a foundation for ministers' political leadership. Groups like the Union League, militias, and fraternal organizations all used the regalia, ritual, and even hymns of church to inform and shape their practices. Racial violence in Reconstruction. Even everyday violence between individuals disproportionately targeted African Americans during Reconstruction. African Americans gained citizenship rights like the ability to serve on juries as a result of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment. But Southern white men were almost never prosecuted for violence against black women. White men beat or shot black men with relative impunity and did so over minor squabbles, labor disputes, long-standing grudges, and crimes of passion. These incidences sometimes were reported to local federal authorities like the Army or the Freedmen's Bureau, but more often than not, such violence was unreported and unprosecuted. The violence committed by organized vigilante groups, sometimes called night riders or bushwhackers, was more often premeditated. Groups of night riders operated under cover of darkness and wore disguises to curtail black political involvement. Night riders harassed and killed black candidates and office holders and frightened voters away from the polls. They also aimed to limit black economic mobility by terrorizing freed people who tried to purchase land or otherwise become too independent from the white enslavers they used to rely on. They were terrorists and vigilantes determined to stop the erosion of the antebellum South, and they were widespread and numerous, operating through the South. The Ku Klux Klan emerged in the late 1860s as the most infamous of these groups. White conservatives would assert that Republicans, in denouncing violence, were waving a bloody shirt for political opportunity. The violence, according to many white conservatives, was fabricated, or not as bad as it was claimed, or an unavoidable consequence of the enfranchisement of African Americans. On December 22nd, 1871, R. Latham of Yorkville, South Carolina, wrote to the New York Tribune, voicing the beliefs of many white Southerners, as he declared that the same principle that prompted the white men of Boston, disguised as Indians, to board during the darkness of night a vessel with tea and throw her cargo into the bay, clothed some of our people in Ku Klux Klan gowns and sent them out on missions technically illegal. Did the Ku Klux do wrong? You were ready to say they did as well, not argue the point with you. Under the peculiar circumstances, what could people of South Carolina do but resort to Ku Kluxing? Victims and witnesses to the violence told a different story. Sally Adkins of Warren County, Georgia, was traveling with her husband, Joseph, a Georgia state senator, when he was assassinated by Klansmen on May 10th, 1869. She wrote President Ulysses S. Grant asking for both physical protection and justice. I am no statesman, she disclaimed. I am only a poor woman whose husband had been murdered for his devotion to his country. I may have very foolish ideas of government, states, and constitutions, but I feel that I have claims upon my country. The rebels imprisoned my husband. Pardoned rebels murdered him. There is no law for the punishment of them who do deeds of this sort. I demand that you, President Grant, keep the pledge you made to the nation. Make it safe for any man to utter boldly and openly his devotion to the United States. The political and social consequences of violence were as lasting as the physical and mental trauma suffered by victims and witnesses. Terrorism worked to end federal involvement in Reconstruction and helped usher in a new era of racial repression.